your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. I had a supervisor that told me that if you want more influence, if you want more impact, and you want more opportunity, there's only one path. I said, what is it? He said, lifelong learning.
Before we jump into this episode, I'd love to invite you to be a part of the community where you can listen to more content to help you be a smarter, stronger, and better equipped, successful leader. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button. I would love and appreciate your support. It's amazing to me to watch the community grow and read all of your comments each and every week. I can't wait to go on the journey with you. Thank you so much, and it means the world to me. Welcome to the Impact Driven Leader podcast with your host, me, Tyler Dickerhoff. On today's episode, I'm joined by Mark Miller. Mark is an amazing individual who has absolutely served me in my life. He is a Wall Street Journal international bestseller. He's also the former visionary vice president of high performance leadership at Chick-fil-A. That's where I first met him several years ago. He played a pivotal role in their expansion from just 75 to over 2,700 locations. He's also the co-founder of Lead Every Day, a newer leadership organization, which I'm excited to hear more about. He dedicates his life to empowering leaders worldwide. He has a new book, a recent book published, Uncommon Greatness. Mark, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to see you again.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in. You know, I've learned from a mentor, if you're going to jump in, might as well be the deep end, get in over your head. So one thing that leaders talk about, people like yourself have spoken about, this global leadership crisis. Our mutual friend, mentor, John Maxwell, is leadership sad. I'd love for you to just kind of dip into that and really how that ties into your work, Uncommon Greatness, and really exploring what this crisis is in American leadership.
It's a multifaceted issue. Organizations are underinvesting in leadership development. And the craziest part of it, and I wish I could talk individually to leaders around the world. I know we're talking to a bunch of them today, but we did a global survey. We ended up talking to or interviewing or including in a focus group over 4,000 leaders before we wrote this book. They were from 6 countries. And a third of them say they don't have enough leaders today. Like that was their response. It's like, okay, great. So then we ask them about the future. 50% of them said they don't believe they're going to have enough for the future. Well, I'm sitting here going, well, whose responsibility is it to fix that? It's like, it's almost a self-indicting statistic. It's like, yes, I've not provided enough leadership to raise up leadership, and I'm not going to provide enough leadership in the future to raise up leadership. And so that's just one sign. I mean, there are many, many others, and many in your audience will be familiar with the annual engagement data. Gallup most famously publishes that, but now Marcus Buckingham, who was formerly with Gallup, now is with ADP, they do their own study. And depending on whose data you're looking at, between 15 and 30% of the American workforce is engaged at work, which means 70 to 85% of the people in the workplace don't care. It's like, that's a leadership crisis. That's not a crisis of the workforce. That's leadership that is allowing that to continue. And again, we could go on, but the stories of people being poorly led would fill all the books written in the world. And we've got to change that. We've got to change that.
I love this. I love when I give you a question, all of a sudden we dig to this point as you gave me 2 figures, right? A lack of leadership where there's just so few leaders in organizations. And then you also threw out me in our audience, the engagement. Those 2, which seem vastly different, both by what I gather from you and what I put together, are dramatically connected. But why is it? It's quite simple for you. It's quite simple for God, whatever, to say, oh, these are connected. But why don't leaders see those, or, businesses, organizations, stockholders, shareholders, why don't they see this like, hey, if we don't have engaged people, they're not going to learn to be leaders. Why is that rift? Why is that chasm there?
At the highest level, I don't believe leaders have seen sufficient return historically on their leadership development efforts.
Oh.
So they're going, well, we're not going to spend that money because it's not helping. Well, I think there's several reasons it's not generating the effect that leaders want. One is that most organizations are sporadic, they're not strategic. They do random acts of training. Now, you've got kids, I've got kids. You probably remember, because yours are a little older. I think you got one young one, but when your kids went to school, when my kids went to school, in first grade or in kindergarten, they don't hand them a trigonometry book. They start with some numbers, and then they learn to add, and then they learn to subtract, and then to multiply, then divide. And if they stay at it long enough, they'll have algebra and geometry and trigonometry and calculus. But what leaders don't generally and don't typically have a scope and sequence for their leaders. And so what they do is often not received well, not applied well. They don't see a return. As the economy ebbs and flows, what gets pressure and often gets cut are those things that leaders don't think making a difference anyway. So the leaders are making the fundamental decision not to invest in something that will ensure their future. And when they have invested in the past, they've not seen a return. So I think you've got to address that problem from multiple angles.
Okay, so if we're talking about, well, we don't want to invest money in leadership development because it just really hasn't paid out. What I would gather to think there is whatever we're investing or how we're investing is not the right stuff. You made comment about this in your book, and I just happened to think of a thought that I read from Adam Grant's latest book, Hidden Potential. And what he stresses in there is that we emphasize too much career skills rather than character skills. Well, in the words that I've seen you write is like we put too much on the skills. Maybe in leadership development, they're talking about, the financials or, strategic, those things, but not the heart skills. That's my theory. What do you think about that?
I think he's absolutely right. Now, I have to confess, I haven't read that book yet, but what you just told me, I agree with 100%. And it's the work that we started at Chick-fil-A more than 25 years ago. And we said there's a skill component and a character component. There's a skill component and there's a heart component. And you actually have to invest in both. And so I think Adam got that right.
Yeah, as I think about that, and Adam talks about, obviously, in his book, this potential people have. And I want to kind of step away from the workforce, right? When you were working at Chick-fil-A, a lot of the, when you would go work with operators, they would have a varied workforce, but a lot of them were young. It was maybe their first job. And if I think back of what the work that you were doing there, and I think about, we just talk about this problem, right? We have lack of leadership development. We have this low engagement. And I wonder, how much are we teaching early employees, whether it's even kids, to say, hey, your job isn't to know all the answers when you show up here, but it's being willing to learn and it's being excited about it. I think when I've gone to Chick-fil-A, that's what they're exceptional at. I have to think you are a part of that. But then I also wonder if that's a missing ingredient here. We don't make the process of learning and developing fun at a young age.
Well, I think that would be true in many, many cases. I might suggest that what trumps even fun is the vision and aspiration for why it matters. I think about my own life, and again, I don't want to project because I'm not assuming this is everybody else's story. But I had a supervisor almost 45 years ago that told me that if you want more influence, if you want more impact, and you want more opportunity, there's only one path. And I said, really? I said, because I think I was a kid, but I said, I think I'd like more influence. I think I'd like more impact. And I think I'd like more opportunity. He said, just one path. I said, what is it? He said, lifelong learning.
Yeah.
I said, is that how the world works? He said, absolutely, that's how the world works. And I walked away from that conversation with this concept kind of emblazoned in my mind and in my heart. Your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. And so I made a decision to pursue lifelong learning because I saw a reason to do so. I always tell folks my parents wish I'd have made that decision much sooner because I was a lousy student. But I made a choice because I wanted more influence, more impact, and more opportunity. And so if it's fun, that's great. But I've learned a lot of stuff from things that weren't fun.
Yeah, well, I mimic, echo that as far as my parents probably wish I was a better student, but yet now my kids, my wife, and they're like, you're always reading, you're always listening to something. And it's, I think, finding this desire and realizing, man, growth unlocks everything like you've shared. But I also believe this, that's not commonly held. I don't believe a lot of leaders think that. They're just kind of like, just go through the motions. And I almost wonder, do you think that's one of the primary factors that we have this leadership crisis? That leaders are too busy to say, hey, I got to spend time to learn?
Okay, so let's go back to busyness for a second, because I have been asked as recently as last week, it seems like I get asked a question in this form or another very, very often. What's the biggest challenge you see leaders facing globally? And I would say it's quicksand, which is a toxic mix, and it varies from individual to individual and season to season, but it often includes busyness, complexity, distractions, fear, fatigue, maybe even a little success. Anything that's impeding you from leading to your full potential is part of your quicksand. And so I'm saying leaders have to get out of quicksand because, to your point, learning, particularly if it's not a decision that leaders have already made, but even if they have, if they find themselves in quicksand, learning is the first thing to jettison because they're in survival mode. But guess what else they don't work on? They don't work on culture. They don't work on engagement. They work on survival. And then they can't help the people around them out of the quicksand because they're in it. So the chances are your leaders that you're supposed to be serving are in there with you. So in essence, the organization is under-led. Oh, by the way, you're not working on leadership development for future generations either. And so the number one problem globally is quicksand. And we did some work around that a few years ago. Some of your audience may be familiar with it. And we published that in a book called Smart Leadership. And it's about how to get out of the quicksand. But that is, it's insidious.
Well,
and it ensnares so many leaders.
I think what happens is through times of challenge, we fall into that quicksand. We don't know how to get out, right? You think about being at quicksand, you're frantic, you want to get out, and you realize, oh no, I need to just slow down. I need to be calm. I need to be more, I guess, reserved in essence and focus on what's really important, not necessarily being frantic. I'm guessing that implication in the office then transcends the rest of society. Where, if we have our executive and they're this frantic, they're busy, right? I'm so busy. Well, then that starts to affect the family. That starts to affect the different schools, all the different things in society. And we start to have this vision. That's what a leader really is. Instead of saying that, oh no, that is just a situation of quicksand, not necessarily what a leader is.
Right. It's what a leader is when ensnared in quicksand. It's not the archetype that we all need to be pursuing.
So how do we get out of that? How do we, as leaders, to say there's a better way? Can we encourage people to say, hey, all right, that's not the way to be?
Again, there's this subtext in much of the work that our team has done over time. Leaders have to make choices. And in fact, we do make choices. The psychologists would tell us that we make about 30,000 randomly conscious choices every day. Well, I'm not talking about those 30,000 randomly. We have said that there are some smart choices. You've heard of the concept of keystone habits, a habit that in fact drives other positive behaviors. Well, there are some keystone choices, we call them smart choices, that will help leaders get out of quicksand. But you've got to decide. You've got to choose, I'm going to get out of quicksand. Yeah, and we have been saying for a long time, if you can conquer those challenges at work and you can't defeat them at home, you still lose, right? You win at work, you lose at home, you still lose. And so we think these are significant issues for leaders in their totality of life, not just their work life.
Well, and I think what happens there is this is, I think, probably new. And I'd love for you to kind of weigh in on this as somebody that's worked, your career started when I was born. That's not to make you feel old. That's just what it is. But
I am old. It is what it is.
But what it shares is as things have evolved and changed, right? And it used to be, it's like, hey, you'd go to work and then you'd go home and you'd leave your work at work and you'd be home to be home. And I think we realize now that it's really hard to do that, especially with all the technology is you're always on, right? You're always connected. And you have to make these conscious efforts to be disconnected. And I think if I were to come back to our initial point of this idea of how can we drive engagement and leadership development, maybe it's focusing more on how do we help that person, whoever they are, wherever they are. Because if we do that, they're not only going to be probably more engaged, they're going to be a better leader at home. And if they're a better leader at home, they might possibly be a better leader here. Now, it's a thought, it's a theory, it's a philosophy. And I'd love for you to just kind of, as your career went through and working at such a heartfelt organization like Chick-fil-A, either through your research or what you've seen, how much of that is like played out?
Well, it's interesting. My oldest son, who's close to your age now, he asked me a question not long ago. He said, "Hey, Dad, what is it that a leader cannot delegate?" And I thought that was a really good question. And we went on to have a really good conversation about that. But the first thing I told him, and I'm not sure this is first, but it's the first thing that came out of my mind, which I think answers your question. A leader can't delegate presence.
I love that.
And that doesn't mean just showing up, but that means being present. And I think to your question, leaders need to be present when they're at work. And I think they need to be present when they're not at work. Because if you're not present, you're not there.
Well, I think what shows up when you're not present, you start to give the idea that something or someone else is more important.
By the way, that's harder to do than it is to say. I want
to be present.
Acknowledge that. Yes, it's not as easy as just, I'll just be present. Yeah. But I think that is the discipline that leaders have to cultivate to be present in that meeting, in that performance review, in that weekly check-in, at the kids' ball game, at dinner with your family or whoever you're having dinner with your friends on the weekend. I think presence is something that we cannot, nor should we attempt to delegate.
What causes that switch to flip to say, I've done this wrong, I need to be present?
Yeah, you may have to set some boundaries to help. Again, I'm no productivity expert, but you may have to actually turn your phone off. Or I'm familiar now with a new product called Arrow, A-R-O. I don't know if you know about this. It's a box, and we've got one in our home, and I've bought a bunch of them to give to friends and coworkers. And it's a box you put your phone in, and you can plug it in, and you can put up to 4 phones in it, and it has an app. And so it helps you track how much time your phone was in the box.
Nice.
So that you can actually come. Ours is right by the back door when you come in the house. If you want to put it in there, plug it in. And again, I'm not suggesting everyone needs that, but some people need that. Or it's how much TV you watch, or it's setting some rituals and disciplines with your family. I mean, I think you may have to set some mechanisms in place to help you, because as you mentioned when we started this, there are just so many things warring for your attention. And if you're not really careful, they actually become the quicksand that's impeding your effectiveness at work and outside of work.
So as we're talking about this quicksand and this, enveloping, I would say, leadership crisis, there's no one area of life that's not touched. And we see some areas that are just rife with it. right? We talk about the executive office. We even look in some homes with the more activities. If I look at our family, all the things that are going on. And I believe that, if we stop and think about, what's our purpose here? What's our purpose as a leader? I start to wonder, is there some mechanism there that can really help people say that, hey, this all adds up together when I want to go back to the engagement or to the leadership development? I think about the person that kind of brings everything together to say, if we actively engage here, we're going to make this better.
Well, we started the conversation a moment ago referencing the upcoming book, Uncommon Greatness. We talk about some fundamentals there, and the first fundamental is to see the future. And I think the future and that preferred picture of what we're trying to create can be the energy and the fuel and the motivation to help us not only keep moving, but to help us stay on track and to stay on course. The Alice in Wonderland line where Alice is asking the cat which way to go. And the cat says, well, where are you trying to go? And she said, I don't much care. He said, well, then any road will get you there. There are a lot of people who are not purposeful because they have not articulated their purpose or their destination. And so people ask me if that's the most important of the fundamentals, and I'd go, well, no, but it is first among equals. Because if you're not trying to accomplish, achieve, or become something, you actually don't need leadership.
Yeah. Well, I believe that, the person of faith, but, without a vision, people perish, right? And that idea, if you can go any pathway, if you have no idea where you're going, but just somewhere different. And I think about the job of a leader. There's a quote I can think of from Nelson Mandela. I've been reading his book, A Long Walk to Freedom, which has been mind-blowing. And he says this, a leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they're just being directed from behind. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. If I reflect on what you were just saying about if people start to have an actual distinctive vision, even if it's not a vision for you or me or whatever else, but some vision actually helps everyone have some vision. That's been my experience, and I'd love to know how in your experience working with different operators to organizations to leaders to throughout, how does that tie in?
Well, I think it ties in at several levels, not the least of which is when you're trying to create a strong culture and organizational alignment. Because as you would know, if you're not aligned, it doesn't really matter how passionate and engaged the people are. In fact, it can create chaos if you have passionate, engaged people who are not aligned. And so I think that's part of what the leaders are trying to do when they have a clear aspiration is they're trying to harness the energy and the passion and the creativity of everyone in their organization. But again, that takes energy, it takes effort, it takes focus, it takes intention, it takes leadership, which goes back to the conversation. If you're in quicksand, you're not working on culture, you're not working on alignment, you're working on survival. And so that's why quicksand is such a problem. It impacts everything that a leader should be doing. And in many cases, it's impacting everything the leader knows they should be doing. It's not a lack of knowledge. It might not even be a lack of skill. They just can't escape their current reality in order to do the things they know to do.
I'd love to, dip back again. You mentioned, your experience with Truett Cathy to, the time they got to spend with John Wood and to, Peter Drucker, these characters of a history that have had such a dramatic impact. I'd love to know if there's more individuals that you can just think of, or maybe stories from those that we can look back and we can navigate. How do we start to fix this leadership crisis from, as you were mentioning, let's focus on teaching what actual leadership is?
Well, the best leaders are going to show you the way. Any of those leaders you mentioned and others that we could brainstorm, they're going to show you what the fundamentals look like in action. They're going to be men and women who embody a leader's heart, because that's the trigger for people to want to follow you, right? I think folks in your audience may be able to bring to mind a leader who has the skills, but you would choose not to follow them. Well, my guess is it's because you have questions about their heart, their character, their intent. So I ask leaders all the time, again, almost on a weekly basis, I'm asking leaders, what are people learning by watching you lead? And I think that's a pretty good question.
We look at this crisis, we look at all these things, and I think you hit on, 3 points right there, the heart, the character, and the intent. And I think this is what, in my opinion, if we look at, I don't want to get political, trust me, Mark, that is not it, but it's a political year, right? And we look at this example of leaders that are before us, and it can be political, it can be organizational. And I think the engagement number that you share comes back to say, well, we really question the heart, the character, and the intent. And it's throughout organizations, it's throughout society. And that's really a problem, because now we have people saying, hey, trust me. And they're like, well, I don't trust anyone because they haven't shown a heart or character or intent to care about me. And that to me seems like the problem to fix.
Yeah, and that's a hard problem. I mean, people ask me all the time, can you impact and in essence change a leader's heart? And I said, only if he or she wants it to change. And the best way, by the way, the best time to form leadership character and to impact that heart, it's a process called parenting. Now, it's really, really hard to reparent an adult, but you can shape their heart. You can shape their character if they want to shape it. So again, back to that theme of choices that leaders make. You've got to choose to be a leader that people want to follow.
Well, and I think that's what, if I stop and think about what drives me, and I think about, people like you who have poured into, individuals like myself. And it's that, man, we're in a crisis, and I'm going to show you the way. And the way is to have heart, to have character, to have intent to serve. I saved this story. I want to mention it now. How I got to know Mark Miller. Mark Miller, my guest right here, the guy sitting right across from me on the camera, I met him at the corporate Chick-fil-A. And we were there for an event, my wife and I, and we were there with John Maxwell. And Mark was in the room. I had no idea who Mark was. He just seemed like somebody there. And he came around. I remember we had lunch, and he said, hey, are you done? Can I take your plate? I said, well, sure. Well, thank you very much. And the next thing I know, Mark is bundling up the trash. And, at the end of the day, he comes around. Is there anything I can get you? And I come to find out, of course, that who you are, the leadership figure at Chick-fil-A. And I was like, oh, well, I can do that. Because that seems natural to me with a lung language of service. And I use that example of that's how I got to know you as a young person. This was almost 7-8 years ago now. As a young person who was starting in my leadership. And I wonder, is that maybe part of the crisis, because we don't see leaders willing to do that because they're by example. It's like, I'm the VP. I should go stand over here and everyone else serves me. I just wonder about that.
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back to the fact that there are different paradigms and even different operating concepts of what leadership is. I tell the story in the book about a 360-degree feedback opportunity that I had, and I love feedback. In fact, I was reminded of the fact that I created my first leadership assessment over 40 years ago. This is before, I'm not even sure they were a thing, but I came up with a bunch of questions, and I asked my team to answer all these questions and send them to a third party so they would have complete anonymity so that I could get the feedback and I could get better. So I've been a feedback junkie my whole career. But just a few years ago, I had the opportunity. I think we were testing or piloting with a new vendor. Anybody want to do a 360? And I said, yeah, let me do it. Let me do it. I want the feedback. And so did this 360, and this was a high-priced one. So it came with a consultant who's going to come to your office afterwards and review your results. And this guy walked in, and it looked like he was visibly shaken. I didn't know if he got some bad news on the way, or he wrecked his car, or his cat died or something, but he looked so bad. The first words out of my mouth were, "Are you okay?" And he said, and he kind of hung his head and he said, yeah, it's about your results. And I went, well, have a seat and we'll talk about it. And I said, it appears as though there's a problem with my results. And he said, when you walk in a room, you're not trying to take charge. And I said, correct. I said, and what is your point? He said, that's what leaders do and you don't. And I said, well, that's your paradigm of leadership. I said, when I walk in a room, I'm trying to figure out how I can add the most value. And sometimes that's to take charge. And sometimes it's to take out the trash. See, this guy's living from a different worldview. He thinks the leader's the person in charge telling people what to do. And I just think that's I don't want to say it's outdated, but it's an inferior form of leadership. And I'm working for something different. I want to add value to every person I meet. That's my goal. That's my intent. Now, I know that's impossible, but the fact that I'm trying, when you start trying to add value to others, immediately your focus shifts from you to them. So you're thinking others first, which is one of the heart habits that the best leaders embody, and it'll actually change your heart if you're trying to add value. The effort is what changes you. And so I think part of the problem is too many leaders are trying to serve themselves as opposed to serving others.
Yeah. I mean, I stop and I think about, interactions, right? And there's people that they make you feel good, like, your example of yourself, like, hey, I have value, as opposed to being in those situations or those rooms where people are like, I'm only here to provide value to you. There's a big difference there, right? I have value. You see value in me, as opposed to I only show up here. I only come to work every day so I can add value to you. The opposite, right? And I think about that in our workplaces. It's no wonder when people are saying, I don't want to step up and be that leader, because that just seems disconnected. It doesn't seem very fun. It doesn't seem enjoyable to look at people and just like, how are you going to serve me in a society where it's like, oh, there's so much around us. The other part of that as you're saying that, I'm thinking, and I'm trying to think of how I would encourage the next generation of workers, right, that are coming into the workplace to say, you know what, when you aim to serve, when you aim to add value, you'll never have a day where you're not valuable.
I like the way you said that. Yeah. And I would encourage your listeners just to spend 3 minutes making a list of ways you can add value. I think you'll be shocked. I mean, you can encourage, you can challenge, you can compliment, on and on and on. And I mean, you can make a long list. You can resource, you can correct, make a list. And you mentioned earlier being a person of faith. If you're a person of faith, you can offer a silent prayer on behalf of that person. There's so many ways you can add value. And every time you try to do that, it's your heart that's changing and you're becoming a leader that people want to follow.
I find that, as you talk about this, being a person that people want to follow, is that we often think of like, well, I see this person and people follow them. I see this person and, they're important. They show up all over in media. They're, having this quote unquote, whatever success may be. And we fall into that trap. And so I start to replicate, and yet I'm not getting the success. One thing that you shared in your book, Uncommon Greatness, and you encourage people to do this, is sit down and brainstorm in a room how, if you wanted to do the opposite. For example, if I wanted to go and just not show up as a leader, all the things I would do. I'd love for you to tell us a story where you've done that and just kind of what happened within that community, that group.
a little context. The mind is a self-optimizing memory system. And so that's a good thing on most days, but it's really not a good thing when you're trying to be creative and you're trying to generate alternatives, because your natural tendency and your wiring is to go back to what is known, what you've already experienced, what you have some confidence will work based on the past. And so one of the techniques to jolt your mind out of those ruts is to ask yourself, what would happen if we did the opposite? And so if you want, and I did this, I think I tell this story in the book, there was a group that was trying to increase attendance at their events. And so I had their leadership team sit down and brainstorm for well over an hour. What would we do if we wanted to depress attendance? And they put everything from make the signage confusing to change the times for the event and don't tell people. And they listed over 100 things, as I recall, maybe close to 200 things that if you were trying to depress attendance. And then I said, okay, now, because that was a new thought for them. They'd never thought about that. So we had effectively jolted them out of those ruts. And I said, now take a look at this list and see if anything, comes to heart and mind. And somebody slowly raised their hand and said, we do a bunch of those things. I said, fantastic. So now let's identify those things we're doing that are depressing attendance and start eliminating those in order to increase attendance. So it's just a way, it's a technique to get you to think differently, and you can apply it in just about any situation. What would you do if you wanted the opposite, and then go from there?
Well, I think about that, and as some of the stats that you listed at the very beginning of our conversation about engaged workforce or emerging leaders, and I think about this. If we were to play out, hey, how do you make a workforce less engaged? Tell them, force them, they have to be in an office, under certain times of the day, right? Tell them that they can't have certain freedoms. Tell them that, in order to be a leader, there's going to be more responsibility on you, but less income or, less freedom, right? All those things that seem to happen in those instances. And it's no wonder we have those metrics showing up through surveys that we do.
Yeah, it's a fun way to approach really serious issues.
One kind of, I guess, jump I want to make here is, as we look at either your career, your experience, but also the day we're in today, where technology seems to pop up and go faster and faster. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on how you think technology, whether it's email, whether it's instant phones, whether it's social media, all those things have made it harder, have amplified, or maybe even alleviated some of this leadership crisis.
Technology, broadly described, has certainly added to the quicksand. 2,614 times a day, the typical person swipes or clicks on their phone. The typical person is receiving or sending 94 text messages a day. And let's don't even get into email. A lot of folks think email is gone. Look at my inbox. It's not gone. It's still out there, right? So I think it has exacerbated the challenge. I think that's now there's certainly upsides, but the downsides have in many ways neutralized the upside, right? Because we're such a distracted people. And here's a fun stat. This was pre-COVID. I don't even know. We could speculate on what has happened since COVID, but the research is that the typical office worker is interrupted every 3 minutes. And I've talked to people and they go, well, sure, that's just the reality. You just have to learn to cope with it. Yeah, but here's the dark side of that stat. The psychologists tell us that on average, it takes 20 minutes to return to your previous level of focus and mental acuity that you had before the distraction. So if you play that out, it is totally conceivable that you could go to work, leave 8 hours later, having never returned to the level of focus and mental acuity that you had when you walked in, because you're being interrupted every 3 minutes. Your mind cannot recover. And so, yeah, distractions, technology, it's making it harder not just for leaders, but for people in general. But leaders have to bear the responsibility for this new level of challenge. I just think it's harder to lead today than it's ever been.
So I think about, a young leader, right? And you think, remember, Mark, when you were young, and if you were in that same instance, and maybe you didn't have the autonomy or authority to say, hey, I need some white space because I have to get these things done. If you think back when you were in that spot in your career, I think myself or, people listening in, man, I got to think that's doubly challenging. It's one thing for a CEO who has an assistant to make sure that they have plenty of white space, right? You can employ that. But if you're that leader who is like, maybe you don't have that authority or autonomy, you constantly feel pulled, I would think.
Oh, I would think so. Again, I think it's more challenging to lead today than ever. But at the same time, leadership is more critical and more essential because of the times we live in. It's a bit of a paradox. It's harder to do, but more important that we do it. And I think we've just got to make a commitment to the fundamentals and say, I'm going to become a leader that sees the future, engages and develop others, reinvent continuously, value results in relationships, and embody a leader's heart. If you don't make that choice, if you don't set that intention in your heart and your head, you don't have a chance of leading well. It's just too hard. You've got to be intentional.
Yeah. Do you think that, these leaders, we're talking about young leaders in this, we talk about this crisis and you're thinking, part of, you made mention about, well, depending on where you want to go, there's any path to get there. And I think, do some of these leaders get so confused in the crisis we're in that, maybe they're chasing money or influence or title that again creates some of this crisis?
Well, it does. And that's actually, again, not trying to go back to the book, but it's the way we set up the book. It's the way we set up the book. The book is called Uncommon Greatness. I think you've got far too many leaders chasing common greatness. Common greatness is about me, and it's about you. It's about us as individuals. It's fleeting, and it's often celebrated, which is one reason people pursue it, but it's not fulfilling. It's not sustainable. It doesn't last. And we make the case in the book that there's a higher standard, and that's uncommon greatness, where it may not be widely recognized, but it elicits greatness from others, and it's lasting and it's fulfilling. I mean, you probably know people, I know people who got to the top of the ladder and realized it was, in fact, the wrong wall. Well, that's what greatness is about. But uncommon greatness is focused on others. We're able to escape the gravitational pull of self in order to serve the people in our organizations and our organization. And at the end of the day, Truett Cathy shared this with me 40 years ago. He said, if you help enough other people get what they want, you'll get what you want. But it starts with serving other people first. And so we believe the path to uncommon greatness is uncommon leadership, which is the stuff we've been talking about for this entire show.
What do you think is going to cause this to change?
Well, individual leaders. See, I used to encourage leaders and try to inspire them and saying, hey, we can change the world. And I've quit doing that. Here's what I now say. I want to encourage leaders to change their world. And if you change yours and I change mine and all the folks listening go change their world, then collectively we can change the world.
Yeah, so it really is showing up in action. It's saying, hey, put this in focus first, kind of the fundamentals that you broke down, the serve, right? And it's, if we do that, focus on that, it'll start to have an outward effect, no matter where you're at, maybe in your hierarchy or organization. Is that fair?
Exactly. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And you bloom where you're planted and you lead well in your sphere of influence. And as that changes, my experience is most often you'll be given more responsibility and more opportunity because organizations are looking for leaders who can create and sustain positive change. And that's the kind of leaders we're talking about.
Yeah. As we talk about this, one thing that begs of me is thinking, all right, I hear what you're saying, Mark, right? And in this conversation about serve and becoming this more outward focused leader. But if I'm in an organization that maybe doesn't value that, maybe they have other things that are centric, that are maybe good character, good values, but this growth piece that you're talking about in changing, they're like, no, you still got to hit results. It's got to be all about results.
Yeah. Well, we talk about that. There's one of the fundamentals is the best leaders value results and relationships, because if you focus exclusively on results, you will suboptimize them over time. But the flip side, if you focus exclusively on relationships, you will certainly suboptimize results. The way you maximize results is to focus on both. It's an example of what Jim Collins talked about years ago, the genius of the and. When you find a way to embrace two things that from time to time are actually in conflict, you release the power that is resident in the tension. And so the best leaders value results and relationships, and they get more results. Now, to the heart of your question, I'm reading below the line just a little bit here. If you're in an organization that actually does not align with your philosophy, your point of view, or the brand of leadership that you believe you need to bring to the world, you got some harder decisions to make, because then that ball's in your court. And you may need to fire your boss or your company, and you may need to go work somewhere else.
That to me is a major contributor to the leadership crisis, right? Because it's like, if I see that, I don't want to be the leader. And then you're like, well, do I venture out into something different? And what costs? And I've seen this metric. I don't know if your work has seen this, that we have an emerging generation. We'll call it the Gen Z, right? The younger millennials that are really stepping into workforce, and they're saying, hey, I want to be developed. And they're almost looking for that more than maybe some of the other benefits. That's what I continue to see through research or interaction, and this idea of what is the identity that I need to hold as a leader. And I think that if anything, maybe you're prescribing kind of this identity.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, what we're talking about is not a strategy, it is an identity to embrace and pursue and to cultivate and to master over time. But let me say this. I've seen similar data and reports, and I talk to young leaders all the time, and I'll go, I am so thankful that you want to learn and grow, because that means you have the opportunity to become an extraordinary, an uncommon leader. Because if you don't want to grow, you're never going to get there. But here's the deal. Do not attempt to shift responsibility for your growth to your organization. If they'll help you, that's great. If they won't help you, that does not relieve you of the responsibility to learn and grow and develop. Because I don't want to put my future in somebody else's hands. Because guess what? Most organizations are going to disappoint you greatly. We just talked about a few minutes ago, 50% of them are telling you they're not going to have enough leaders for the future. Oh, why not? Because they're not going to develop them. So if you want to set yourself apart, capitalize on that instinct and that desire to learn and grow by owning your own growth and development. And if they'll help you, fantastic. If they won't, you do it anyway.
Let me circle back to the game we were playing about if we don't want this leadership crisis to correct, right? If we're going to play that, hey, what would we do to continue to perpetuate it? And I think about even in America, or heck, we could look back to the Roman Empire and how it fell apart. What are you things that we would continue to do to pull at the fabric of America kind of along this crisis that will help identify things not to do, that you think would perpetuate this?
Well, if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you always got or something less, right? And so what organizations are doing today is not working. So if they continue to do that, it is not going to work in the future. I mean, it's foolish to think that if you keep doing what you've been doing that hasn't worked, that all of a sudden it's going to start working. I think that's why leaders are so pessimistic as they look to the future, because all they're assuming is, well, if we do what we're doing, it's not working, so it's not going to work in the future. And I'm going, well, change it. Change it. Too many leaders look at change as a distraction. or they look at change as a burden. I'm going, create and sustaining positive change in service of a vision is your job. So if you don't think you're going to have enough leaders in the future, change it. You don't like your culture, change it. If you're in quicksand, get out. I mean, too many leaders have given up their agency. They forfeited their leadership. They keep the title of leader, but their behaviors are nowhere aligned with what leaders do, not what great leaders do.
How about share with me an organization or something that you've seen or someone that you've displayed where they actually do make this transformation? Give us some hope to kind of, spin away here with.
Well, I would ask the listeners to think about the leaders that they've encountered who led exceptionally well, men and women who they would want to follow. And there's your answer. I mean, I had the privilege of working with Truett Cathy for decades. I mean, he selected me. I was the 16th corporate employee. And Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, the man who invented the Chick-fil-A sandwich, interviewed me and selected me to join his team. And I had a front row seat for decades. And everything we've talked about is possible. And if your listeners reflect, they know men and women like this. They just have to decide to become that leader themselves. And then get on the journey and get her done.
Well, and I think that's been a great societal testimony is what Chick-fil-A has done, even though mounting pressure at times and all the different ways. Well, you can't do it that way. And yet, as an organization, continue. One final question mark here as we wrap up. Based upon that and based upon your insights, what's your vision of leadership in America? What do you think the future of that is? What does it look like in 5, 7, how many ever years you want to put on that?
Well, I dream of a world well led. Schools, churches, hospitals, armies, chicken restaurants. Just imagine. Think about the best leader you know. What would happen if we had millions and millions and millions of those leaders? Our organization, Lead Every Day, we're trying to figure out how to serve 100 million leaders in the next 7 years. We'll see. But that's what we're chasing because we dream of a world well led.
Mark, where can people learn more about you, your latest book? Where can they get information about that?
Well, first, let me give my cell number because people often have questions about something we've talked about. That number is 678-612-8441. And my email is mark@leadeveryday.com. Love to hear from you. We do have a website, leadeveryday.com, and on there you can find free resources and more info about the book. And of course, Uncommon Greatness is now available anywhere you buy books. And so we're excited to have that out in the world.
Awesome. Mark, well, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all the viewers and listeners. Remember to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. And then by rating and reviewing each episode, you can help more people discover impactful leaders like Mark. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.